This episode is brought to you by SPACE, Supportive Parents for Anxious Childhood Emotions. SPACE is a program for parents with children and adolescents who experience anxiety, OCD, and related problems. Go to neurodiversity.university for details and to register.
Now we expect kids to find that area of excellence when they're really quite young. And the way they tell us that they're not ready for that is by looking like they're unmotivated and unwilling to try new things because they're afraid they're not going to be successful in them.
How many of us have ever felt that our kids or students just don't care? Or maybe we had people ask us when we were young why we were so unmotivated. Motivation is the key to unlocking the momentum for progress that kids need. Today's guest is Dr. Ellen Braaten, and she's the author of the new book, Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less. She'll share with us what we can do to help our children unleash their ability and harness that motivation. That's straight ahead on episode 171. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
We are wrapping up the end of the school year and getting ready to transition into the summer routine. If you're an educator and you would like to use your summer to take some deep dives into your areas of special interest, remember that the Neurodiversity University has a bunch of courses available for you to start learning today. We've got courses about the affective and motivation needs of twice exceptional learners, a course to help educators understand and support dyslexic students, and more. Go to neurodiversity.university or click the link in the show notes to check out all the options. And remember, if your district is looking for ideas for your in-house professional development for next year, these are available for you to use on a wide scale within your district. You can request all of the info from the neurodiversity.university website. Okay, my conversation with Dr. Ellen Braaten is up next.
Summer has been reduced to a challenge of finding something for your kids to do. And it's especially hard for differently wired kids with unique needs and interests. Traditional summer camps don't address your child's strengths or interests because, frankly, it's often outside their scope. So this summer, there's something new to consider. The Young Scholars Academy has a variety of camps throughout the summer designed with neurodivergent kids in mind and conducted by neurodivergent mentors. Whether they choose STEM or humanities pathways, they'll find camps with a variety of subjects and interests, and they will be in a group with like-minded peers they can bond with and who understand them. Young Scholars Academy was founded by a former Bridges Academy instructor who knows how your kiddo's brain works. That means they'll feel understood, and they'll be in an environment where they can shine. There's a link in the show notes for more info and a promo code for a 10% discount if you decide to enroll. It could make this summer a life-changing experience for your kids. Check the link in the show notes and check out Young Scholars Academy's summer camps.
This is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Today, I'm excited to welcome back Dr. Ellen Braaten to the podcast. Ellen is Executive Director of the Learning and Emotional Assessment Program at Massachusetts General Hospital and author of the recently released book, Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less. So, Ellen, thank you so much for making time to talk to me today.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here.
Motivation is one of my favorite topics when we talk about supporting kids who are struggling, because I feel like sometimes it really just feels like it's kind of all or nothing. Like as parents and educators, we are either blaming a child's struggles entirely on a lack of motivation, or we completely ignore how much motivation really does kind of impact everything that we do. So what was it that started to bring the issue of motivation really into focus for you?
So it's funny. I really started this book thinking about kids who really couldn't care less about anything. So it wasn't like it started out as a book on motivation. It was really more a book that looked at kids who were just having trouble in everything, who didn't see what the point of life was. What is the point of studying? What's the point of doing all the things that you're asking me to do? And then, of course, the point is, it's about motivation, and motivation is the why we do things that we do. It's the reason for it. And so it became more of a book about motivation because I was most interested in these kids. And I had written a book a few years ago called Bright Kids Who Can't Keep Up. And so I was thinking about, so what happens to these kids who are having trouble keeping up? Well, they wind up being kids who don't really care very much. And really what I found in writing this book is lots of kids, not only kids who are neurodiverse or have trouble keeping up, but lots of kids, lots of adults are having trouble figuring out why. Why am I, what's the purpose? What's the point in all this? And I think part of it is coming out of a pandemic. It's almost like we're all living through this sort of existential crisis of, we've got to reboot in a way why we're doing what we're doing and how to find pleasure and meaning in that. And that's really what motivation is about. It's about where's my pleasure? Where's the meaning? What's the purpose?
I think we're all familiar with the idea of a kid who's just like a non-producer, or another term I sometimes use for kids who aren't fully engaged is like a selective consumer. They kind of pick and choose.
Yeah.
What are some of the signs of a lack of motivation that might even just go unnoticed if we aren't paying attention?
So it's really the child who doesn't seem to like anything. Now, I have to say lots of adolescents are going to appear that way anyway. Nah, I don't like that. No, that's no good. But it's a little bit more than that. It's not just the kid who tells his parents, yeah, no, that's not what I want to do, or, your ideas are dumb. But it's the kid who just doesn't seem to find pleasure in anything. Now, like you said, there are always those kids who have perhaps even comorbid depression or anxiety or, social anxiety, for example. It's hard for them to get out and put themselves out there. But it's really, when we're looking at those subtle signs, it's the child who parents are saying like, I just don't know if he really cares about much anymore, or he just doesn't seem to want to do anything like he used to want to do things. Or for some kids, parents will say to me, he never was really that into anything, even back in preschool. Those subtle symptoms of not really looking like you're having a whole lot of fun in lots of different areas of life.
Our society is so built on the importance of like being a joiner or being engaged in a lot of things. And so for kids who kind of have some of those things going on, it can be really concerning for parents or, kind of looking forward, like, what is this going to mean?
So I think you're really right about this. And especially when we're talking about kids who think differently or learn differently, a lot of times they don't seem like the children, like you're right, the ones who can't wait to get to soccer camp in the summertime or can't wait to join a particular club. Sometimes I think we tend to label those kids as unmotivated, and then they may or may not be unmotivated. Mm-hmm. There are some kids who just like to sort of piddle around. They just sort of like putt around and try different things before they find their bliss. And that can take, when I was a kid, oftentimes you didn't find what you were really good at until you were like 14, 15, 16, even older. But now we expect kids to find that area of excellence when they're really quite young. And the way they tell us that they're not ready for that is by looking like they're unmotivated and unwilling to try new things because they're afraid they're not going to be successful in them.
I think that this talks a lot about also when we talk about like parental expectations. So, for example, I was just talking with a client the other day, and there's a particular sport that they play. The parents are very involved in that community. They have a sibling that plays this sport, whatever. This kiddo is not very interested in that, but they have started to find their place in the theater community at their school, which they love, but their parents are really continuing to push this other activity that they really truly are not motivated to do for a variety of reasons. I mean, you could think about the different social dynamics in those two environments, but then the parents are concerned, like, why aren't they motivated to do this thing that we've invested all of this time and money and other things into? Can you talk a little bit about how parental expectations just in general kind of influence all of these things and how we perceive what our kids are motivated to do or not?
Oh, you practically described the whole thing right there. I see this kind of issue all the time where parents have this expectation. Sometimes it comes from our own issues that we had as kids. We wished we could have been the soccer star. We wish we could have been the writer. We wish for some parents, it's the opposite. They wish they could have been the actor in their high school play, but instead their parents push them into sports. And I really feel like what you just described is a huge issue in demotivating kids. And we tend to want to love the kid who we want that kid to be, as opposed to the kid who is right in front of us telling us what they already love to do. And it can be very hard for us to not come into parenting with our own expectations about what we want our child to be and how we want them to be. And sometimes it's that you've already built your community. And for this parent, I don't know this family, of course, that you're describing, but sometimes, that's their whole social life too. And they don't know how they're going to now connect with other parents who are involved in that area, in the school play. And, I do feel like parents have to think about having their own lives outside of their kids' own activities. When you have a child, you oftentimes find a whole new peer group, and it often is wrapped up in your child's activities, which often are what your interests are. And so I really feel like parents should start figuring out the kinds of things that they want to do and they love to do and that motivate them. That can help their kids have the space to find their own things that they're motivated to do.
Yeah, definitely. I think also a lot of times, especially as we talk about neurodivergent students, a lot of advocates are really on a different level trying to unlearn some of the internalized expectations that we have about what kids should be able to do. Do you have any ideas about how we could examine our own expectations to really kind of develop more realistic ways to view our kids' abilities and what they're motivated to do?
Yeah, I do. One of the things that I talk about in the book, and I give a bunch of links to this in my book, that parents can do different sorts of tests that are online, that are free actually, that can look at their own areas of strengths and to examine their own. And I'm talking not just about strengths like cognition and math, but also things like humor, curiosity, love of learning, humility. All of these sorts of things are different kinds of strengths that we don't tend to think about as strengths. And what we might value is not what our child values. So if our child is strong in humility and, forgiveness and that sort of thing, and we're really strong in love of learning, that doesn't mean that your child's not going to love learning, but it means that you're coming into parenting with a different set of strengths and expectations that your child has. So your child might be quite good at, for instance, taking care of others, taking care of animals, for example, might be better off volunteering at an animal shelter when you want them to be captain of the math team. And that's not necessarily, it might have something to do with their math ability, but might have something really else to do with who they are. So one of the things you want to really be doing as a parent is still working on yourself. When I became a parent, I put all of my eggs in my kids' basket, so to speak, that I wanted to understand them better, but really through my own lens of who, my own sort of failures, things I didn't get to do, hopes that I had for them. So yeah, I think one of the first things we need to do is to do some exploration of who we are and not forget who we were before we became a parent. Mm-hmm. Of course, it becomes a lot more complicated when we have a child who is neurodiverse, and we have to then even expand our worldview. I give an example in the book when I was pregnant with my first child, and I was thinking to myself that, my child could be anything she wanted to be, anything at all. And talking with a group of mothers, they could be artists. At this time, this 30 years ago, being an artist or a writer, that was not thought of as something that was okay because we wanted our kids to achieve. It's interesting how the pendulum swings, but it's like what came into my mind was, I don't want my child to be an accountant. Like that would just be the worst thing in the world. My gosh, she's going to sit in an office all day and just look at numbers. And I want her to be this creative soul or CEO, whatever it was. And I realized that what I didn't want my child to be was normal, to be normal and boring, or you really need to sort of explore what are the limits of what you think your child can be. And of course, our expectations are not their expectations. We just have to let go of it all. And that's what's hard to do.
Yeah. Really recognizing that they are kind of their own people. And as parents, we try to present opportunities and options and ideas, and sometimes they take and sometimes they don't. And in clinical work, we talk about countertransference, right, between the clinician and the client. We have these emotions about how people are presenting to us, and we kind of have to move away from that a little bit. It is hard, especially when you have a child who's not motivated in the way that whatever your expectations are. Like, you really have to be aware of that in order to step away from it, to allow them to blossom, because otherwise they might really stifle themselves in that area where they could be really strong or motivated, because they feel like they need to try to meet those expectations that you're putting out there, perhaps not even overtly.
Yeah, you're so right. That's such a great example about countertransference. And for people who don't know that, it's exactly how you explained it, is that as a therapist, you're having a reaction to what the patient or the client is bringing to you. And in parenting, we don't tend to think about that. Like, my reaction to what the child is doing is based on me. The cure for that, so to speak, is to be aware of that. Like, oh, what they're saying is making me feel this way. Is that because what they're saying is valid and I need to pay attention to that in order to help them? Or is my reaction because of stuff that I have that's unresolved? And that's something that parents have to really think about. You know, is what my child's doing is because I'm realistically worried about them, or is it because I have this own stuff that I've never taken care of myself?
More in a minute.
If your child deals with anxiety or OCD, it's likely you've tried any number of strategies to help them. But if you're still struggling, we're launching a new program that may be just what you've been looking for. It's called SPACE, Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. It's a parent-based program that helps parents help their kids with anxiety, obsessive-compulsive thoughts, and other related problems. SPACE was developed by Dr. Ellie Leibowitz at the Yale Child Study Center.
SPACE really is teaching the parent how to be supportive and teaching the parent how to recognize and reduce their accommodations. And clinical trial research from multiple studies indicates that it's a very efficacious way of treating anxiety and OCD. And so I think that can be a very helpful resource for a lot of families.
This podcast parent organization, the Neurodiversity Alliance, has agreed to be a SPACE-trained provider, and we are now taking registrations for a limited number of spots that are available. Follow the link in the show notes or go to neurodiversity.university and click the link. It's a proven tool to help parents help their kids. I know that motivation and executive functioning are really intertwined. And a lot of those kids who maybe have some of those neurodivergent diagnoses really can appear to struggle with motivation. What are some things that we need to consider as we sort of look through the layers of different learning needs and abilities and a lack of motivation? And are there ways, I guess, that we can support those two things kind of differently? Like, or are they always just kind of one and the same?
No, I think that we need to think about this in a complex way. So one of the things I talk about in the book is I did this acronym that's APP, and it stands for aptitude, practice, and pleasure. And so what I sort of came up with in terms of motivation is we've got to think about all of those three things. We've got to think about the aptitude. What are we naturally good at? What are the things that give us pleasure? And what are the things we tend to practice, for better use of a word? What are the sorts of things we do if we're given unlimited time? Now, a lot of times those three things are in line with each other, that the things we're good at, we tend to spend time doing, and they tend to give us pleasure, but not always. Sometimes we get pleasure from things that are actually kind of hard for us to do. For example, a child who has dyslexia might still love reading, but it just takes more of an effort for them to do that, but they still might enjoy it for different reasons. Sometimes we enjoy things because we love the sort of striving for superiority over what is difficult for us. So for a child who's neurodivergent or who has executive functions or learning issues, there are two things. One is that the things they're good at might be obscured by the fact that they have trouble doing those things. So, for example, they might be very good or naturally gifted in music, for example, but may have trouble practicing that, even though they might want to do that, but because they have trouble managing their schedule, for example. So as adults, we need to be sort of thinking about that. What is this child showing me that they're good at? And for some of us, we've had evaluations done, so we have a good idea about what is it academically or cognitively that they're good at. But I think we need to think more broadly outside of those categories. For example, the sorts of things I was talking about before. But we want to make sure that we're supporting them in that area of executive function skills so they're having time to do what they need to do. So if a child has trouble with processing speed, for example, and time management is difficult for them, we want to make sure that we're supporting them in that way. Again, getting out of their way, not sort of imposing our own, like, this is what I want you to do in your free time. This is what I think you should be doing, but I'm helping you manage your time or giving you the support you need so that you can be in that zone of that aptitude and pleasures particularly.
I kind of just had this moment of realization here. So my oldest is a very talented musician, even from a really young age. And it's interesting because he could pick it up and play it. And we gave him, the opportunity to go to lessons, and he did this. So he had the aptitude and he had the practice, but he has really significant performance anxiety and does not like to perform to the point where outside of our immediate family, like not even like grandparents and stuff like that, like he just can't quite do it. And ultimately, we've kind of moved away from that, even though he has the aptitude. And I know for us as parents, that was really hard to let that go because we could see that, but it was causing so much stress and anxiety. And it's like at some point, if you're a musician, you have to kind of perform or do something with it. And it was a real shift for us. But I think that overlap there of those three aspects really kind of does fit there.
It's such a great example. I had exactly the same situation. So I was a music major for part of my college experience, played piano. So I am a frustrated musician myself. So I wish that I would have had the opportunities, could have started playing piano earlier, blah, blah, blah. My daughter started playing violin, same thing. Extremely talented, naturally talented, would practice pretty much, but didn't like it. She didn't have performance anxiety per se, although that was a little bit a part of it. Because if you love playing, you love performing, seriously. Yes, a lot of performers have trouble with it, but when they're done, they're like, wow, I had this. And she just didn't. And that's a great example where all three of those things have to be in sync, and I let it go as well. It's still she's in her 30s now. If I bring up the word violin, like, oh, Hannah was so good, she still rolls her eyes. Like, I know, Mom. I still think it was a great experience for her. She wound up doing other things that were great for her. For example, she wound up being a fencer. I think that discipline that she learned studying music at an earlier age transferred into a whole different thing, which was a sport that I knew nothing about. She wound up being very good at it, and she practiced it like crazy. She loved getting out there on the, whatever it was, the mat, and, wound up doing it in college. And again, I had to sort of step out of the way, but it was just something she wanted to learn. But I think that it was really hard for me to let that go. Mm-hmm. I can totally relate to what you're saying.
This kind of leads into my next question, which is about strengths-based interventions, because when I talk to teachers and parents, we talk a lot about strengths-based supports. That's an ideal that we want to work toward. And I think everybody really gets behind that. I think everyone understands the benefit of that. However, I do think that there's sometimes a hard transition, taking it from the idea and conceptualizing it to putting it into practice. Are there some ideas or strategies that you have that people could integrate in order to really find some of those specific strength-based strategies to improve motivation?
So one of the things that I don't know if this is what you're looking for, but one of the simple things I think that we need to start to do is to relabel some of those difficulties or negative labels in terms of positive attributes. So for example, sort of thinking about a difficult child as a strong-willed child, or processing speed is one of those things I'm interested in, sort of instead of slow processor, deep thinker. Now, this does not take away the fact that we still have areas that they need to work on, but I think a lot of this is changing our own attitudes to help kids understand that if they're, sort of unfocused, they're also a kid who likes exploring things, like bossy versus determined, or picky versus discerning. We need to start to think, okay, if I've got this negative label on this child, there's almost always a different way of looking at that can be a positive attribute. For example, I am sort of picky. I am one of those people who is always looking at oh, I could do that better. But that's also a positive thing. I'm discerning. Okay, so how can I use that skill so that it's not a negative, but it's used as a positive? And so, if you're a child who's very introverted and kind of shy, you can also sort of think as that child is calm and attentive. All right, so what can we learn from that child? And when you're thinking about kids in a classroom, you've got all of those kinds of kids in a classroom. And you need to start thinking about, well, what can we learn from one another about your negative and positive attributes? Because they're often one and the same. And so if teachers can start to think about that in terms of labeling those sorts of things as their opposite, I think that we can use that in a healthier kind of way.
Leaning into those characteristics as opposed to trying to change them.
Exactly. An annoying child is also a persistent child. Okay, so sometimes this gets you in trouble, Billy. How can we use your persistence as a way of getting your homework done more? Or how could, because they get so much attention for being annoying, for always asking the questions, or, do you know what I mean? That annoying kind of child. Well, that's a persistent child. It's a child who can't let go of something. Okay, so how can we use that now in this sort of assignment that you've got here? And, it's not a one-time shot. This is a sort of thing that we as people are constantly learning about ourselves. But being able to pinpoint some of those things for a child in a positive way helps them integrate that. And as adults, it's the best thing to know that, I can overdo it in this way, but that also means that I can use that in this way.
Yeah. I think no motivation conversation would be complete without talking about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So I'm curious about your views about extrinsic motivators, prizes and punishments. I feel like my mantra is always nothing without nuance. And I think that having realistic expectations of the world, and that means realizing that there's an extrinsic value to most everything that we do.
Yeah.
We can't always get totally away from that.
Yeah.
But are there some times that you feel like using extrinsic motivators might be specifically valuable versus times when maybe we wouldn't want to use them as much?
Yeah, this is a great question. Yes, there are. I mean, we all are extrinsically motivated. I mean, we were talking before we started today about writing books. And for me, sometimes I hit a wall where I'm and I love writing, but I'm okay, I'm going to take my computer to the coffee shop and I'm going to get myself a pastry and a great coffee. And that is an extrinsic motivation, even for something that I'm intrinsically motivated to do. We all need certain things that will say, okay, when you do this, you get this. The important thing is that we're conscious of it and that we don't automatically, extrinsically motivate kids for something that they should be intrinsically motivated to do. So, for example, reading is one of those things. We've learned that if we extrinsically always motivate kids for reading, they just think that reading is something that they have to get a reward to do as opposed to something they just want to do. And I think that's one of those things where we need to give kids a lot of time to sort of putter around to find out what they love to do. Turn off the TV, turn off the social media, go make yourself useful or find something to do we don't like to do that in our world. It's like we need, what's our goal now? And sometimes the goal is to just sort of, find out what you want to do right now, given unlimited time or given a certain time with nothing scheduled. So we just want to make sure we're conscious of what sorts of things we're extrinsically motivating ourselves for. And typically, they're the things that we can't quite do without an extrinsic motivation. But you want to make sure you know that with kids. Sort of like, for most of the time, reading should be its own pleasure. But I know that you've got this really tough book to read. When you're done with this, we will do X. So it's the conscious part of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation that's really important.
Just elaborating on that, having the explicit conversation with your kids about how and why, because I think, like you mentioned at the very beginning, it's something that you can do for yourself. And how can we get kids to be able to regulate that themselves in the future too, where they can decide, like, what is the reward I can give myself, or how can I do this without needing a parent or a teacher or something implementing it?
Absolutely. And I don't mean to pick on reading, but for some of us, reading it is the extrinsic motivator.
Oh, yeah.
If I get done with this, I'm going to sit down and read for a while. For other people, it's not, and that's okay. If you're like, reading just isn't something that is a thing that just gives me pleasure, but I do like listening to podcasts, or I do like listening to books on tape, or whatever it is. And in that case, it's like my extrinsic reward for listening to something is taking a walk while I'm doing it. We've got to figure out, what is it? Again, that gets back to that pleasure issue. What gives me pleasure, and how can I use that as a motivating factor to do the things that I need to do, but might not always be pleasurable for me?
I know we could keep talking about this topic all day, but as time is getting short, I do have just one last question for you.
Sure.
So if you were talking directly to one of your young clients and they've internalized this message from their parents and from society that they're unmotivated and they don't care about anything, what would you just really want them to hear?
I would start by asking them a bunch of questions, actually. I would first say, I'm hearing a lot from your parents or teachers, and they're saying like you're unmotivated, or I might not even use the word unmotivated, but nothing seems to appeal to you. What do you think about that? Like, is it valid? And most of the time kids will say no, unless, and I think it's important to bring this up, they're extremely depressed, extremely anxious. That's a different story. I mean, when we're depressed or really anxious about something, that is part of the symptoms of depression, is unmotivation. We're not talking about that. But I would say, so what I'm hearing from them is what they think is unmotivation, you think is they're not listening to you. So I would then say to them, tell me what you need to be feeling more motivated, or tell me the sorts of things that you would wish you had time to do. And a lot of times what kids will say is, they're just putting too much pressure on me. Like, they care about this stuff and I just don't care about this. Or, if it's a college-bound student is what I was going to say, but a high school student, they might say like, my parents think I should be going to college and I don't want to go to college, or I need time off, or I don't want to go to the kind of college they're sending me to. And that's really helpful, because what I often find is that kids who don't want to do what their parents want to do show them by looking like they're unmotivated. So opening up that discussion, I think, is where I would start with that kind of student. Is what I'm hearing is this. Tell me, is that really the story? And what can I help them understand about what's going on for you?
Dr. Ellen Braaten, author of Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Slapping the label of unmotivated on a child or teen is rarely a useful descriptor. At best, it's what we can see from our outside perspective. But a young person's internal experience is a vital piece of this puzzle and is necessary when we investigate what might be holding them back from engaging with certain tasks. Ultimately, though, helping them become more aware of their emotions and their ability to self-advocate combined with our own ability to reflect on our expectations and interpretations of their actions, can help them feel empowered, engaged, and motivated to move toward their goals. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thank you to Dr. Ellen Braaten from Massachusetts General for information about their learning and emotional assessment program, or to get her book, Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less. You'll find links in the show notes. Also, parents, we talked about two very good resources for you, the SPACE program and Young Scholars Academy's summer camps. You'll find details about those in the show notes as well. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us here, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.